This is the video for chapter 5.2 on natural selection. Okay, so we talked about in a previous chapter how evolution is a cumulative change over long periods of time, inheritable characteristics in a population. So if that's what evolution is, something has to drive or cause that evolution. And that happens to be something that we call natural selection. Natural selection is dependent on having variations in the DNA within populations. So sexual reproducers, like animals, have a lot of variation. So remember, forming those gametes in meiosis involves things like crossing over and random orientation. I'm not going to write out orientation. That'll be a disaster, okay? But basically it means that our offspring are going to have a lot of different variation. Asexual reproducers like prokaryotes or bacteria have very little variation, so they generally depend on mutation, okay, and don't have as much of that variation as a sexual reproducing organism. So let's imagine that all the individuals in a given population are identical. That's an amazing thing if you are well suited for your environment and if that environment doesn't change. But if something in the environment changes and all of your offspring are identical, that means all of them are going to be wiped out. So in general, having a large variation in a population, again, population means same species, is a really good thing, because if something in the environment changes and some individuals aren't well suited, perhaps some other individuals have a variation that does allow them to survive and then reproduce. Now, our understanding of genetics and of artificial and natural selection has given rise to a bunch of great things. But unfortunately, there have been quite a few ill-advised and unethical events that have taken place using that knowledge. And one of them is eugenics. So we do this all the time with animals, right? We pick the desirable animals, the ones with those desirable traits, and we breed them together, and we end up with cumulative changes and desirable offspring. Well, eugenics is kind of the same thing, except for we're controlling human breeding. And that's in an attempt to improve the population by favoring certain characteristics. So back in the early part of the 1900s and well into the mid-1900s in the US, eugenics was still very prevalent, of taking certain members of the population who were considered to be carrying undesirable traits and eliminating them from the gene pool by either killing them or most likely by sterilizing them, and so therefore not being able to pass their genes along to their offspring. So I think the ethical implications there are pretty clear, and so you can expand upon that on your own. But it's also important to note that what we consider to be desirable doesn't necessarily have to do with our long-term survivability. So again, having variation within our population is a good thing if something in our environment changes. And what we consider to be healthy or desirable isn't always what's best for our long-term survival as a species. Okay, so in order for evolution to occur, I have to have the variation in the population, okay? Because things don't just change because they feel like it, okay? Things are selected for and against because some variations help them to fit within niches better than others. And those three main causes of variations are mutations, meiosis, and sexual reproduction. So let's talk mutation first. Okay, so mutation, we know, is some kind of a change in the genetic sequence, okay? Whether you are altering an allele, altering a base pair, or whether you are substituting, inserting, deleting something. So if that mutation then gives this individual some kind of a survival or reproductive advantage, then that mutation is going to be passed down and become more common because the individual with that mutation then has the ability to survive and reproduce with a greater frequency. And so that peppered moth that we talked about, that's maybe not the most scientifically accurate or ethical example, is a great kind of showcase of how a mutation, when this black color is a mutation, can become more common because it gives the individual with that mutation more of an opportunity to pass along its genes. In general, though, mutations have a much smaller effect than sexual reproduction. So the colored moth is definitely a weirdo, not common occurrence. And that's because in each generation, only a few genes are going to experience a mutation. So if you think about the fact that you have 3 billion base pairs in your DNA, those are commas, and maybe like 40 to 100 of those base pairs experience a mutation. Well, not all of our base pairs are part of genes. So maybe that means only 1 or 2 genes, okay, actually experience a mutation. And sometimes they're silent mutations. They don't even alter the amino acid sequence, or the protein isn't really all that different. Okay, so mutations do produce some variation, but not nearly as much as sexual reproduction. Okay, so since we're going to talk meiosis, let's just go back and do a quick review. So mitosis produces somatic cells, which are our body cells, like skin cells, liver cells, bone cells. Meiosis produces gametes, like the eggs and the sperm. In mitosis, we're going to end up with diploid cells, so the chromosomes come in pairs, whereas in meiosis, those are haploid cells. In mitosis, we go through one cell division, so the cell splits once, whereas in meiosis, the cell splits twice. In mitosis, we end up with 2 daughter cells, whereas in meiosis, we end up with 4. In mitosis, they are all supposed to be identical. Of course, some copies can experience a mutation or a problem with replication, but in general, they're identical. In meiosis, they are all different. So remember, crossing over, random orientation, okay, those things are going to cause the gametes to be all genetically unique. In mitosis, our cells produced in humans result in cells that have 46 or 23 pairs of chromosomes, whereas our gametes have just 23. So this, remember, is the 2n number, and this is the n number. All right, so in meiosis, during prophase 1, we're going to get crossing over. So that, again, and I'm going to zoom in here, is where some of the genetic material between homologous pairs is flip-flopped. Okay, it's swapped between maternal and paternal chromosomes. Okay, and then also in metaphase, so both metaphase 1 and metaphase 2, those chromosomes line up in random orientation. So here I have blue on one side, gray on another. They could have easily switched, and then we would have ended up with a very different formation or combination of gametes. Same thing here in meiosis 1, those sister chromatids could have been flopped around. So random orientation and crossing over ensure that the 4 gametes produced by meiosis are all very different. And of course, we kind of can calculate that difference with this equation, 2 to the n, where n is the haploid number. Okay, so we've also previously talked about how sexual reproducers are at an advantage to asexual reproducers, whether that be like something like a bacterium or a plant that can undergo cloning. And that's because sexual reproduction produces enough variety to where an environmental change probably won't kill an entire population, just certain members. Okay, asexual reproducers, not so much. So you're going to notice as we talk about this topic of natural selection that some words are used very differently in everyday language than they are in a biological sense. And one of them is adaptation. So if I say that a rabbit can shed its brown fur and grow white fur for the winter in order to be better camouflaged against the snow, and this is a good adaptation to have in order to hide from predators, we have to be very careful because, again, an adaptation isn't something that I can just decide to do. An adaptation is a heritable trait. It has to be in your DNA. So it's something that you already have, okay, that's making it easier for you to survive and reproduce in your environment. It is not something that is acquired, okay, throughout an individual's lifetime. And the same word here, or the same thing goes here with fitness, right? So fitness, I think of like, how many push-ups can I do? Can I run fast? Okay, fitness has nothing to do with that in a biological sense. So fitness is the degree to which an organism's inherited traits help it survive and reproduce in its environment. So in this environment, this individual probably has a high degree of fitness, and this individual probably has a low degree of fitness. And it has nothing to do with if this beetle can run fast and jump high. Okay, those are acquired characteristics in some ways, okay? It has everything to do with how likely something is to be able to survive and reproduce in its environment. So many of you have not reproduced yet, right? So I will just go ahead and tell you that reproduction is an insane energy suck, okay? So even producing eggs or sperm takes a lot of metabolic energy. Producing offspring takes a whole lot of metabolic energy. And so if I'm creating a whole bunch of offspring and I'm spending all of that energy, okay, but only a small fraction of them survive, why the heck would I ever do that? Well, it's all about numbers, okay? So the more offspring that you produce, the greater the chances that one or more will survive to reproductive age, because all this mommy goose cares about is passing along her DNA. And in order for her to pass along her DNA, not only does her child need to survive, okay, but that child also needs to pass along its DNA. Okay, so the likelihood of that happening goes up when you produce more offspring. Please don't try that at home. We're not talking about humans here. We're talking about in the wild. Now, the only problem with that is that having so many offspring creates what we call a struggle for survival. There is always going to be a high demand for resources like water, space, nutrients, sunlight, whatever. And so if we have too many offspring and not enough resources, that's going to give an advantage to certain offspring. So if we have plenty of resources, there's no competition, then who cares if you're better adapted than someone else? But I will tell you, if the buffet doesn't have enough food for everybody, only the ones that have a high degree of fitness, okay, are going to be able to survive and reproduce in that environment. Okay, so I'm sure you've come to the same conclusions as I have by now about natural selection, but let's go ahead and write these out just so we're clear. Okay, so the first thing that we need in order for natural selection to occur is an overproduction of offspring. Okay, again, they have to have some variation in them, and some of those variations are going to be useful and some are going to be harmful. That's just the nature of the beast. Okay, some of those variations are going to help us, some not so much. All right, the second thing that we need is that the individuals that are poorly adapted or have a low degree of fitness, I swear that says fitness, have less of a chance of surviving. Not no chance. It's not a guarantee that they'll be eliminated from the gene pool. It's just that their chances go down. All right. On the same token, organisms that are well adapted to that environment have a better chance of surviving. Okay, so at first it's all about survival. I'm going to have some variations. Some are going to give me a lower chance of surviving. Some are give me a better chance of surviving. Then the organisms that are able to survive are then going to have not a guarantee, but a better chance of reproducing. And when we have a better chance of reproducing, it's more likely that we're going to pass on those successful traits to the next generation. Okay, so you have to be very clear and careful if you're answering IB prompts about making sure that you include this word chance. Okay, it's not a guarantee, it's all about the odds. And then, of course, over many generations, okay, we're going to see an accumulation of those changes. And that's really what evolution is. Remember, it's the cumulative change in heritable characteristics in a population over time. Okay, so that accumulation of all those small changes, because some organisms have a better chance than others, is really what's going to result in evolution by natural selection. So again, just so we're clear, okay, having a high degree of fitness and being well adapted doesn't guarantee success. It just increases the probability. Sometimes crap happens, okay, and you get eliminated from the gene pool whether you were well adapted or not, okay? It's not a guarantee. It's all about probability. Okay, so if you've understood what we've talked about so far, then you should be able to answer some basic questions on your own, like explain why the genes of less fit individuals are more likely to be eliminated from the gene pool, or explain why the genes of more fit individuals are likely to increase in frequency in a population's gene pool. And I'm going to encourage you, as you answer those good questions, to use some of the keywords that we've talked about. And again, I would also consider you to use words like probability or chance rather than guarantees. So evolution is usually really slow, okay? So to evolve markedly different characteristics usually takes a long period of time because those variations are not so pronounced. But we're going to take a look at two examples. We're going to take a look at pesticide resistance in rats. Oh, lovely. And antibiotic resistance in bacteria. And what we're going to find is unique about these is how quickly those populations evolve. So we say that evolution is generally slow, but it's not always slow. All right, so I want to tell you a little story about one of the animals that I'm not so terribly fond of, which is rats. Okay, so let's say you're a farmer and you want to get rid of all the rats so they don't eat your crops. Well, what you can do is you can apply a pesticide to the field and you think that you have killed all of the rats. Okay, but rats are products of natural selection. There's going to be natural variation in there. They're sexual reproducers. And a few of the rats from that population are slightly different and are not affected. So all the rats die except for a couple lucky few that have the variation that makes them not affected by the poison. Well, these rats are able to survive and reproduce, and now they don't have any of the normal rats to compete with for food and resources. So these resistant crazy rats reproduce and breed like crazy. And now you have a whole population that is resistant. So seeing all these new rats, the farmer applies even more poison, but it's the same kind of poison that they used last time, and fewer of the rats die, again, because they've passed along their resistant gene here. And so this causes the farmer to have to use a different pesticide this time, okay, because this population has developed a resistance to that. So I want you to take some time to fill in the table that talks about how that story fits within all of the rules of natural selection. So I want you to figure out, how does it fulfill the requirement of having variation? How are some individuals more fit than others? How does overproduction lead to a struggle? How does passing along of successful traits to the next generation work in there? Okay, and I also want you to answer the question at the bottom, okay, where it says, explain why it's incorrect to say that the rats became immune. Okay, so I'll help you out there. Remember that immunity is not the same as resistant. They didn't become immune. It wasn't like one rat. How do you draw a rat? Like that with ears? I don't know. Okay. It wasn't like one rat was like, oh, I'm not so fond of this poison. I think I'm going to like become immune. It doesn't work like that. Immunity or resistance in this case is genetic. It's not something that you can decide to acquire. You're either born with it or not. So again, take a couple moments to fill out that table and the question at the bottom of the page. Now, because you're such a great farmer, okay, let's move on to your sheep operation. Okay, long tails in sheep really isn't that desirable because it gets them dirty, whether it's from mud or poop, okay, it gets their nice clean wool dirty, and we don't want that. So oftentimes farmers will cut off the tails of their sheep. So what I'd like you to do is explain why the sheep, even though we want their tails to be cut, why are those sheep continuing to be born with these long tails? And if I wanted sheep to be born with short tails, what should I do? And I'll give you a hint here. It should have something to do with what we talked about with artificial selection and how that works. All right, now let's talk about one more example here. And I want to talk about the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So let's say a woman, maybe our sheep farmer, gets a bacterial infection like tuberculosis, and that's in her lungs. Well, since it's a bacterial infection, her doctor gives her an antibiotic to kill the bacteria. And she gets better because most of the bacteria get destroyed by that antibiotic. All right. However, one bacterium has a gene, a mutation in their genes that causes this bacterium to be resistant to that antibiotic. All right, well, this is not killed by the antibiotic, but all of the normal ones are. So again, just like the rats, this bacterium isn't competing for space or resources. So what's going to happen is that this bacterium is going to be free to reproduce like crazy, and then all of the offspring will have that same gene for resistance. And so she starts to get sick again because her lungs are now filled with bacteria again. She goes to the back to the doctor. The doctor says, okay, here's some more of that antibiotic that I already gave you. And she takes it, but there's no result. Okay, so what happens then is the doctor has to find a different antibiotic and hope that these guys aren't resistant to that, and hope that we even have different antibiotics that are available for that bacterium. So kind of a risky game here with antibiotic resistance. So again, you should be able to fill in that table and get ready to share your answers when I see you in class. And that'll show me how much you understand about evolution and natural selection. And that'll do it for chapter 5.2.